St. Clair, Ohio, was a town built on the ghosts of industry. The skeletal remains of steel mills rusted silently against a perpetually gray sky, a constant reminder of a promise that had packed up and left decades ago. On its cracked sidewalks, hope was a currency scarcer than a steady job. For Nia Clark, however, the town wasn't a graveyard of dreams. It was the place she served. As a registered nurse at St. Clair General, she was a beacon of calm efficiency in the controlled chaos of the emergency room, her warm smile a balm for the town's weary and wounded. At 30, she moved with a quiet confidence that belied the exhaustion simmering in the town around her. Her professionalism was her shield, her empathy, her strength. Her husband, Terrell Evans, wore a different kind of mask. To the customers at his struggling auto repair shop on the edge of town, he was a miracle worker, a man with grease-stained hands who could coax life back into dying engines. He was tall, with broad shoulders that seemed capable of carrying the weight of the world, and a deep voice that resonated with authority. They had met 7 years ago at a 4th of July cookout, back when his eyes held a fire of ambition, not the smoldering embers of resentment they held now. He had spoken of building an empire of garages, of giving her a life far from the crumbling streets of St. Clair. Nia had fallen in love with that dream, with the man who seemed determined to build a new world for them with his own 2 hands. Their small clapboard house, with its peeling white paint and slightly crooked porch, was their castle. But lately, its walls had begun to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a pressure cooker. Terrell's dream of expansion had stalled, choked by bad loans and what he called a system rigged against guys like me. The phrase had become his mantra, a bitter explanation for every setback. At first, Nia had been his staunchest defender, offering encouragement and her own steady paycheck to keep the business afloat. But his bitterness was a creeping mold, slowly covering every bright surface of their life together. The initial cracks were subtle, almost invisible. It started with money. "You sure you needed to buy that brand-named coffee, Nia?" he'd ask, his tone light but the question heavy. Every dollar counts when they're trying to bleed you dry. He began scrutinizing their bank statements, questioning her small indulgences, a new set of scrubs, a lunch out with her friends. He framed it as fiscal responsibility, a team effort to survive, but it felt like control, a slow tightening of a leash she hadn't realized was around her neck. Then, the resentment began to pivot toward her. Her success became an indictment of his failure. One evening, she came home buzzing with excitement after receiving a commendation for her work during a multi-car pileup on the interstate. She found Terrell sitting in the dim light of the living room, nursing a beer. "They gave me the Nurse of the Month award," she said, her voice bright. "Can you believe it? They're putting my picture up in the main lobby." Terrell didn't look at her. He took a long, slow swallow of his beer. "Must be nice," he muttered into the bottle. "Being the hospital's favorite. They love a success story, don't they? Especially one that looks like you. Makes them feel progressive." The implication hung in the air, ugly and sharp. He was twisting her achievement, a testament to her hard work and skill, into a token of racial pandering. It stung more than any overt insult could. "That's not fair, Terrell," she said, her voice losing its celebratory edge. "I worked hard for this." "We all work hard," he shot back, his eyes finally meeting hers, cold and flat. "Some of us just don't get a gold star for it." The polarization of their world was stark. Her life was one of structure, science, and saving lives, a world where effort yielded results. His was a world of conspiracy and shadows, where unseen forces conspired against him, where his lack of success was always someone else's fault. He was the victim, and she, with her steady job and professional respect, was becoming an uncomfortable reminder of what he wasn't. The arguments grew more frequent, circular, and exhausting. They were always about the same thing: his perceived victimhood and her perceived complicity in a system that celebrated her while crushing him. She learned to shrink herself, to dim her own light to keep from inflaming his darkness. She stopped talking about her good days at work. She made excuses when her friends invited her out. The house grew quieter, the air thick with unspoken tensions. One rainy Tuesday, the quiet finally broke. Nia had been saving for months, tucking away a little extra from each paycheck into a separate account he didn't know about. It was for a surprise anniversary trip, a weekend away in a cabin by the lake. She wanted to reconnect, to find the man she had married beneath the layers of bitterness. That afternoon, she found the perfect place online and put down a deposit. That evening, as she was putting away laundry, a delicate porcelain vase, a final gift from her grandmother, slipped from her grasp and shattered on the hardwood floor. Terrell stormed into the room, his face a mask of thunder. "What was that? What did you do now?" "It was an accident," Naya said, her voice trembling as she knelt to pick up the pieces. "It just slipped." "Always an accident with you," he roared, his voice echoing in the small room. "You have any idea what things cost? You just break things without a second thought, because you know your hospital buddies will just give you another award, another paycheck." He kicked at a large piece of the broken vase, sending it skittering across the floor. His rage was terrifyingly out of proportion, a wildfire consuming the last bit of oxygen in the room. He was breathing heavily, his fists clenched, his eyes wild. Nia froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had never seen him like this. This wasn't just anger, this was a loss of control. It was a darkness she had only glimpsed before, now fully unleashed. Then, as quickly as it came, the storm passed. His shoulders slumped. He ran a hand over his face, and when he looked at her again, his eyes were filled with a chillingly calm remorse. "I'm sorry, baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He knelt beside her, gently taking the sharp porcelain from her hands. "I'm so sorry. I'm just under so much pressure. It's not you. It's everything else. Forgive me?" He looked at her, his expression pleading. But beneath the apology, Nia felt a deep, primal fear. The speed of the change was what terrified her. It wasn't the anger itself, but the mask of sanity that could slip on and off so seamlessly. The shattered vase became a symbol of their marriage, something beautiful and irreplaceable, now lying in fragments. Terrell's apology had been swift and seemingly sincere, but the violence of his outburst lingered in the house like a toxic residue. The incident marked a turning point. The subtle mechanisms of control he had been building for years were now reinforced with the concrete of fear. The walls of their home, once a symbol of their shared dream, were beginning to feel like the enclosure of a cage. Terrell's paranoia sharpened, focusing its lens on Nia's life outside the house. A few days after the vase incident, he came home with a new phone for her. "An upgrade," he announced with a wide smile, the picture of a doting husband. "You deserve the best, baby. It's got a better camera, more storage, everything." He insisted on setting it up for her, transferring all her contacts and apps himself. Nia, wanting to believe this was a peace offering, accepted gratefully. It was only a week later when he casually mentioned a specific comment a coworker had made in a private text message thread that a cold dread washed over her. "How did you know she said that?" Nia asked, trying to keep her voice even. Terrell shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "You must have told me. You know how my memory is for little details." But she hadn't told him. She knew with chilling certainty that he had installed some kind of monitoring software on the new phone. Her private conversations, her plans with friends, her every typed word were no longer her own. She was a stage, and he was the unseen audience. The discovery was profoundly violating, a digital intrusion that mirrored the emotional one she was already enduring. His campaign of isolation intensified. Her friends, once a regular presence in their home, were now treated with cold suspicion. If her friend Brenda stopped by after a shift, Terrell would sit in the living room, silent and glowering, until the atmosphere became so uncomfortable that Brenda would make a hasty excuse and leave. Afterward, the interrogation would begin. What did she want? What were you two whispering about? She's always trying to put ideas in your head, isn't she? Telling you you're too good for me. He was particularly venomous about her male colleagues. If Dr. Evans, a kind, fatherly figure at the hospital, was mentioned, Terrell's jaw would tighten. "That old man got a little too much interest in his nurses, you ask me," he'd sneer. He painted every man she worked with as a predator and her as a naive object of their desire. It was a twisted form of gaslighting. By making her feel constantly under suspicion, he forced her to second-guess every innocent interaction, to police her own behavior until she was walking on eggshells both at home and at work. The theme of race became his most potent weapon. He saw conspiracies everywhere, convinced that the world was designed to see him, a black man, fail. When a major corporate client took their fleet of vehicles to a larger, white-owned garage, it wasn't a business decision to Terrell, it was a racist attack. "You see," he'd rage, pacing the kitchen, "they can't stand to see a brother get ahead. They'll smile in your face and then stab you in the back the first chance they get." You'd think he tried to pull Nia into his worldview, to make her see the same shadows he saw. "You don't get it, Nia, because you're their prize. You're the one they can point to and say, 'Look, we're not racist. We gave her an award.' You're the exception that proves the rule, and you're letting them use you." The polarization between them was a chasm. Nia had faced racism, the subtle slights and systemic hurdles that were a part of her reality. But she refused to let it define her or be an excuse for failure. She believed in her own agency, in the power of her skill and hard work. For Terrell, his racial identity had become a shield for his personal shortcomings, a lens through which every disappointment was magnified into a deliberate act of oppression. He was creating a narrative where he was a righteous warrior against a racist world, and she was, at best, a naive collaborator, and at worst, a traitor. Her world shrank with each passing week. The phone calls to friends became less frequent. She'd text in the hospital bathroom, feeling like a spy in her own life. The house, once filled with the scent of her baking and the sound of music, became eerily silent. She would come home from a grueling 12-hour shift, her body aching and her mind frayed, to find Terrell waiting, his mood a landmine she had to navigate with extreme caution. The contrast was dizzying. At the hospital, she was respected, competent, in control. She made life or death decisions. At home, she was a suspect, constantly on trial for crimes she hadn't committed. The breaking point arrived on a Friday night in late October. Nia had been feeling increasingly trapped and had begun to quietly research legal aid services online, using the hospital computers during her lunch break. The thought of leaving was terrifying, but the thought of staying was becoming unbearable. That evening, a letter arrived in the mail from a credit card company she didn't recognize, addressed to her. Curious, she opened it. It was a statement with a balance of over $5,000. There were charges for high-end car parts, expensive tools, and cash advances from an ATM near a local bar. Her blood ran cold. She knew without a doubt that Terrell had opened a card in her name. He had forged her signature, ruined her credit, and lied to her face for months. It wasn't just about the money. It was the depth of the deception. It was a calculated act of theft from the one person who had been trying to hold their world together. She confronted him that night, her voice shaking but firm, the credit card statement clutched in her hand. "What is this, Terrell?" He glanced at it, and his face hardened. He didn't even try to feign ignorance. "It's business, things I needed for the shop. It was an investment." "An investment? With a credit card in my name that I knew nothing about?" Nia's voice rose, filled with a sense of betrayal so profound it made her dizzy. "You stole from me. You lied to me." "Stole from you?" he snarled, advancing on her. "Everything I do is for us. While you're off playing hero at the hospital, I'm the one breaking my back trying to keep our heads above water in a world that wants to see me drown. A little debt is nothing compared to that." "This isn't about debt, it's about trust," she cried. "There is no us if there's no trust." His eyes went black with fury. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. "Don't you talk to me about trust," he seethed, his voice a low growl. He was inches from her now, his presence overwhelming in the small kitchen. "Don't you dare!" Before she could react, he shoved her, hard. It wasn't a casual push. It was a violent, deliberate act. Nia stumbled backward, her feet tangling, and crashed against the refrigerator, the air knocked from her lungs. The metallic clang of her head hitting the handle echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. She slid to the floor, stunned and breathless, staring up at the man she had married. He stood over her, his chest heaving, his face a grotesque mixture of rage and shock at his own action. For the first time, she wasn't just afraid of his anger. She was afraid for her life. The cold linoleum floor of the kitchen was a harsh reality against Nia's cheek. The ringing in her ears slowly subsided, replaced by the sound of Terrell's ragged breathing. In his eyes, she saw not remorse, but a flicker of something far more terrifying. Justification. The line had been crossed. The invisible barrier of civility that had, until now, contained his rage had been irrevocably breached. From that moment on, Naya knew she wasn't just in a bad marriage, she was in danger. The days that followed were thick with a tense, artificial calm. Terrell was sickeningly attentive, a parody of the man he once was. He made her breakfast, left her little notes, told her how much he loved her. But his apologies were no longer comforting. They were threats veiled in affection, a reminder of the rage that lay just beneath the surface and a warning of what he was capable of. For Naya, the house had transformed. Every room held the echo of his violence, every corner a potential trap. Sleep offered little respite, haunted by nightmares of his face contorted in fury. Her secret plan to leave was no longer a vague idea. It became an urgent, meticulously plotted escape. At the hospital, she used her breaks to transfer the small funds she'd saved into a new, hidden bank account. She researched women's shelters in neighboring counties, memorizing addresses and phone numbers. She discreetly packed a go bag with a change of clothes, her essential documents, and the last of her grandmother's jewelry, hiding it deep in the back of her locker at work. Each small act of preparation was a reclamation of her own life, a quiet rebellion against his suffocating control. She was no longer just surviving, she was planning her liberation. She decided to act on a Thursday. Terrell had a late night at the shop, a supposed emergency repair for a client. This was her window. Her plan was simple. She would go home, collect the few personal items she couldn't bear to leave behind, write him a short, simple note, and drive to a friend's house 2 towns over before he returned. From there, she would contact a lawyer and begin the process of untangling her life from his. When she walked into the house that evening, however, her stomach dropped. Terrell's truck was in the driveway. He was home early. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses in front of him. The artificial smile he gave her did nothing to hide the unnerving intensity in his eyes. "Hey, baby," he said, his voice unnaturally smooth. "Finished up early. Thought we could have a quiet night. Just us." Nia's heart hammered against her ribs. Her escape plan had just evaporated. "Oh," she said, forcing a smile. "That's nice. I know things have been tense," he continued, pouring a generous amount of whiskey into each glass. "And it's my fault. I've been letting the stress get to me, but I'm going to fix it. I'm going to fix us, I promise." He pushed a glass toward her, a toast to a new beginning. Nia's mind raced. To refuse the drink would be to signal suspicion, to potentially trigger the very explosion she was trying to avoid. She had to play along. She had to wait for another chance. She raised her glass, her hand trembling slightly. "To a new beginning," she echoed, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. She took a small sip, the whiskey burning a trail down her throat. They talked for a while, the conversation stilted and strange. Terrell did most of the talking, spinning fantasies about the future, a new garage, a bigger house, even children. It was the same dream he'd sold her years ago, but now it sounded hollow, rehearsed. Nia just nodded, her mind a whirlwind of aborted plans and rising panic. As he spoke, she felt a profound sense of finality. She looked at his face, the face she had once loved so deeply, and she no longer recognized the man behind it. The love was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. She had to leave. Not tomorrow, not next week. Tonight. She waited until he went to the bathroom. This was it. This was her only chance. She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. She decided to forget the extra belongings. She would just grab her purse and run. But as she took a step toward the door, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The room tilted violently. Her limbs felt heavy, disconnected from her brain. "The drink," she thought with a surge of pure terror. He put something in the drink. The bathroom door opened. Terrell stood there, watching her sway. The mask was gone. In its place was an expression of chilling, predatory calm. "Feeling tired, baby?" he asked, his voice soft. "What did you do?" she slurred, her words thick and clumsy. She tried to take another step, but her legs buckled. He caught her easily, his arms strong and unyielding. "It's okay," he whispered, his lips close to her ear. "I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to fix everything." He lifted her into his arms. She fought, but her movements were sluggish, useless. Her vision was tunneling, the edges turning black. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her completely was his face, no longer angry, no longer remorseful, but serene. It was the face of a man who had made a decision, a man who believed he was enacting a righteous, terrible justice. Consciousness returned not as a gentle awakening, but as a brutal shock, a gasp for air that didn't come, a profound, bone-deep cold. Her head throbbed, and a metallic taste coated her tongue. She wasn't in their bed. She wasn't even on the familiar plush of the living room carpet. She tried to push herself up, and her hand slipped on a slick, cold surface. She was on a floor, but it wasn't wood or tile. It was cold, hard cement. She blinked, her vision slowly clearing in the dim light of a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. She recognized the smell of damp earth and motor oil, the basement. He had taken her to the basement, her heart seized with a new, sharper fear. She sat up, wincing as every muscle screamed in protest. She saw Terrell a few feet away. His back was to her. He was humming a quiet, tuneless melody, a sound so grotesquely normal it made the hair on her arms stand up. He was crouched down, methodically wiping down the pristine white surface of a brand new, industrial-sized chest freezer. It was plugged in, its motor emitting a low, predatory hum. And in that instant, Nia understood. This wasn't a punishment. This wasn't an act of rage. This was an execution. The low, relentless hum of the chest freezer filled the damp basement air, a mechanical heartbeat counting down the final moments of Nia's life. The realization of Terrell's plan hit her not with a wave of panic, but with a paralyzing, ice-cold clarity. The drug drink, the descent into the basement, the presence of this gleaming white sarcophagus, it was all premeditated. He hadn't just snapped, he had plotted. This was his new beginning. "Terrell," she managed, her voice a dry rasp. "What are you doing?" He turned slowly, a roll of paper towels in his hand. The serene expression was still on his face. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. "I'm fixing things, Nia," he said, his voice gentle as if explaining something to a child. "You wanted to leave. You wanted to break us apart. I can't let that happen. You're my wife, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. Remember?" He took a step toward her, and Nia scrambled backward on the cold concrete, her sluggish limbs betraying her desperation to flee. "Please, Terrell," she begged, the words catching in her throat. "We can talk about this. We can work it out." "We're past talking, baby," he said, his voice losing its gentle edge, replaced by a chilling finality. "I tried talking. I tried everything. But you and your friends, your fancy doctor pals, you all think you're better than me. You are going to leave me, make me look like a fool. I can't have that." He tossed the paper towels aside and grabbed a glass of water from a nearby crate. "You're dehydrated. You should drink this." She shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "No!" His face hardened. "Drink it, Nia." He knelt, grabbing her jaw with one powerful hand, forcing her mouth open. He poured the water down her throat. She choked and sputtered, but most of it went down. It tasted clean, but she knew it was tainted. Another dose. A stronger one, to ensure she wouldn't fight back. Her last hope of resistance was being systematically extinguished. The effects were almost immediate. The world began to swim again, the single bare bulb fracturing into a dozen dancing lights. Her body felt impossibly heavy, her thoughts dissolving into a thick, confusing fog. Terrell lifted her again, his movements efficient and unhurried. He carried her to the freezer, the cold radiating from its surface even before he opened the lid with a soft whoosh of displaced air. He laid her inside. The metal was shockingly, painfully cold against her skin, even through her clothes. It was like lying on a slab of ice. "I do love you, Nia," he whispered, his face hovering above her in the opening. "I hope you know that. I'm doing this because I love you. So, we can always be together." He stroked her hair, a gesture of grotesque tenderness. Then he closed the lid. The world plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. The soft click of the latch was the sound of her tomb being sealed. For a moment, there was only the sound of her own frantic, ragged breathing echoing in the confined space. Then, the panic, primal and overwhelming, erupted. A scream tore from her throat, but it was swallowed by the insulated walls. She thrashed, beating her fists against the lid, her feet kicking against the cold metal sides. It was useless. She was trapped. After what felt like an eternity, the initial surge of adrenaline receded, leaving her exhausted and trembling. The second dose of the drug was pulling her down, a heavy anchor dragging her toward unconsciousness. Her last conscious thought was not of love or memories, but of the cold. A cold so profound, so absolute, it felt like a living entity, seeping into her bones, slowing her heart, stealing the very breath from her lungs. When she woke again, it was to a different level of consciousness. She wasn't groggy, she was hyper-aware. The darkness was no longer just the absence of light, it was a physical presence. And the cold was a symphony of agony. It was 1,000 tiny needles piercing her skin, a crushing weight on her chest. Her muscles were clenched so tightly they screamed in protest. She tried to take a deep breath, and the icy air burned her lungs. She was alive. The realization was both a miracle and a curse. He had intended for her to slip away peacefully in a drugged sleep, but she had woken up to her own slow, freezing death. She tried to move, to sit up, but her head immediately hit the lid above her. The space was coffin-like, just long enough for her to lie down, just wide enough to feel impossibly restrictive. Groping around, her numb fingers brushed against 2 wire baskets, the kind used for organizing frozen foods. They were empty. He had prepared the space for her. Renewed panic gave her a surge of strength. She placed her palms flat against the lid and pushed with every ounce of energy she possessed. Her muscles strained, her joints cried out, but the lid moved. It lifted, perhaps 1/4 of an inch, letting in a sliver of the dim basement light, a gasp of slightly less frigid air. Hope, sharp and desperate, flooded through her. She pushed harder, gritting her teeth. The lid rose another fraction of an inch and then stopped with a solid, metallic thud. It wouldn't go any further. She let it fall back, her arms trembling with exhaustion. She pushed again, with the same result. Something was blocking it from the outside, something heavy. She remembered the way Terrell had moved around the basement after bringing her down, the sound of him stacking things. A wave of nausea and despair washed over her as she pictured it. His toolbox, maybe the old engine block he'd been meaning to scrap, piled on top of the lid. A simple, brutal, and effective trap. He had thought of everything. There was no escape. She was entombed. The hum of the compressor kicked in again, a low, murderous growl promising to drive the temperature down even further. Trapped in the icy dark, Nia realized her husband hadn't just left her to die. He had engineered her own personal hell. The sliver of light from the ill-fitting lid was both a lifeline and a torment. It was just enough to confirm the horrifying reality of her prison, but not enough to offer any real hope. In that oppressive, freezing darkness, the terrified woman began to recede, and the nurse took over. Nia knew that panic was a luxury she could not afford. It would elevate her heart rate, make her breathe faster, and accelerate the loss of precious body heat. Survival, if it was even possible, depended on cold, hard logic. Her first thought was insulation. The metal floor of the freezer was leaching the warmth from her body at an alarming rate. With numb, clumsy fingers, she managed to unhook the 2 wire baskets from the freezer's inner ledge. She laid them on the bottom, creating a thin, web-like barrier between her body and the frozen steel. It was a pitifully small defense, but it was something. She curled herself into the tightest fetal position she could manage, tucking her hands between her thighs and pulling her knees to her chest. She focused on her breathing, forcing it into a slow, deliberate rhythm she'd taught countless anxious patients. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 2, exhale for 4. Conserve energy, conserve oxygen, conserve heat. Time became a meaningless concept. It stretched and compressed, measured only by the cycling hum of the compressor and the creeping numbness in her extremities. Her toes were the first to go, the pins and needles sensation fading into a dead, woody lack of feeling. Then her fingers. Hypothermia, she knew, was an insidious killer. It would lull her into a drowsy, peaceful state. Sleep would seem like a warm, welcoming blanket, but it was a death shroud. She had to fight it. It was in this state of chilling clarity that a new thought took root, one born not of hope for survival, but of a fierce, burning need for justice. If she was going to die in this icy tomb, Terrell would not get away with it. He would not be allowed to craft a story of a wife who simply walked away. He would not be allowed to mourn her publicly while privately celebrating his freedom. She would make her body the last witness. She would leave a message that no one could erase. Her mind seized on the wire baskets. They were coated in plastic but made of steel. If she could break off a piece, she focused on one of the baskets, fumbling in the dark to find a joint where the wires were welded together. Her fingers, stiff and unresponsive as frozen twigs, could barely grip it. She began to rock the wire back and forth, a small, repetitive motion that sent jolts of pain through her frozen joints. Back and forth, back and forth. The motion was agonizing, the progress imperceptible. She counted the movements, the numbers a mantra to keep her focused, to keep the deadly drowsiness at bay. 48, 49, 50. With a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot in the confined space, the wire snapped. A small 6-inch piece fell away. She fumbled for it, her heart pounding a frantic, hopeful rhythm. Her numb fingers closed around it. One end, where it had broken from the weld, was jagged and sharp, a makeshift stylus, her weapon. Now, where to write her final testament? It had to be somewhere they would find during an autopsy, but not so obvious that Terrell would see it if he opened the lid to check on his handiwork. Not her arms, not her face, her leg, the inside of her thigh. It was usually covered, personal, a place a killer might overlook. With her teeth, she managed to pull up the leg of her sweatpants, exposing her skin to the brutal cold. The flesh was already numb, which she knew was both a blessing and a curse. She took the sharp piece of wire in her trembling hand, positioned the point against her thigh, and began to carve. The first letter was a T. The sensation was bizarre, a deep pressure-like pain with none of the sharp stings she would normally feel. It was like writing on leather. She pressed harder, scraping the wire across her frozen skin. A dark line appeared, but it wasn't just an indentation. It was blood, welling up slowly, thick and sluggish in the extreme cold. It didn't run. Instead, it froze almost instantly, forming a thin, crystalline bead of crimson. Letter by agonizing letter, she etched her accusation into her own flesh. Terrell. Each stroke was a battle against her own body. Her hand shook violently. The muscles in her arms screamed. The sheer effort was immense, but the thought of his face, the serene, monstrous calm as he closed the lid, fueled her. She would not be silenced. She would make her skin scream the truth. DIDTHIS. When she finished, a raw, frozen bas-relief of her husband's guilt was permanently etched onto her body. The blood had frozen solid, creating raised dark red letters that were chillingly legible to the touch. It was a message from the grave, written before she had even entered it. Exhausted, she let the piece of wire fall from her nerveless fingers. Her work was done. A strange sense of peace settled over her. She had done all she could. She had fought back in the only way left to her. She curled back into her tight ball, her mission complete. The drowsiness she had been fighting so hard now seemed less like an enemy and more like a gentle release. The cold was no longer a piercing pain, but a deep, numbing embrace. Her thoughts began to drift, her memories detaching like autumn leaves. She thought of her grandmother's warm kitchen, the smell of baking bread. She thought of the sun on her face during a summer picnic, long before Terrell's shadow had fallen over her life. The hum of the freezer was a lullaby. The darkness was a blanket. As her consciousness began to fade into the profound, irresistible silence of the cold, Nia Clark clung to a single, defiant thought. He had taken her life, but he would not take her voice. Her final words were not spoken, but carved in blood and ice, a permanent scar on the canvas of his crime. While Nia fought for every breath in her icy prison, Terrell Evans moved through the world above with a chilling, theatrical normalcy. His performance began the moment he secured the lid of the freezer with a heavy-duty padlock and stacked 2 rusty toolboxes on top for good measure. He ascended the basement stairs not as a man who had just condemned his wife to a horrific death, but as one who had finally solved a difficult problem. In his twisted mind, this wasn't murder. It was an act of preservation. He was preserving his pride, his reputation, and the version of their life he felt entitled to. His first act was to methodically erase Nia's immediate presence from the house. He gathered the 2 whiskey glasses from the kitchen, washed them, and put them away. He found the note she had started to write him, A simple, heartbreaking, "Terrell, I have to leave. I'm sorry. Nia," and burned it in the kitchen sink, watching the paper curl into black ash. He then took her purse, car keys, and the go bag she had packed, which he discovered in her closet, and hid them in the attic, buried beneath old holiday decorations. He was sanitizing the crime scene, transforming it back into the stage for his next act, the worried, abandoned husband. The centerpiece of his deception was Nia's phone. He had it in his possession, a powerful tool for creating his narrative. That night, he began to meticulously craft his digital alibi. He sent a text to Nia's best friend, Brenda. "Hey B, need some space. Things W. Terrell have been rough. Going to stay with my aunt in Michigan for a while to clear my head. Don't worry, I'll call when I'm ready. Zoe." He sent a similar, more professional email to her nursing supervisor at the hospital, explaining a sudden family emergency that required her to take an immediate leave of absence. He was careful with his wording, mimicking Nia's tone and using emojis she favored. He was building a wall of plausible deniability, brick by digital brick. Each message sent was another shovelful of earth on his wife's premature grave. The next morning, he followed his routine. He woke up, made coffee for one, and went to work at the shop. When a customer asked where Nia was, noting her car was still in the driveway, Terrell sighed with practiced weariness. "She took off," he said, shaking his head. "Hopped a bus last night. Said she needed to find herself. I tell you, man, you think you know someone." He let the sentence hang, inviting the customer to fill in the blanks with their own assumptions about flighty, unpredictable women. His performance was masterful. He was a portrait of masculine stoicism, a man wronged but bearing his pain with quiet dignity. He elicited sympathy, not suspicion. The town of St. Clair, with its traditional values, was predisposed to believe him. The narrative of a hard-working man, abandoned by his successful, perhaps overly ambitious wife, was an easy one to swallow. His most crucial performance was for his next-door neighbor, Samuel "Sam" Jones. Sam was a retired Army veteran, a quiet, observant man who spent most of his days tending his small garden or walking his old German shepherd Shadow. Sam and Nia had a friendly rapport, often chatting over the fence about her nursing shifts or his prize-winning tomatoes. Terrell knew that convincing Sam was key to solidifying his story within the neighborhood. He caught Sam by the fence that afternoon, as the older man was weeding his flower beds. Terrell leaned against the post, forcing a look of exhausted sadness onto his face. "Afternoon, Sam," Terrell said, his voice subdued. "Terrell?" Sam replied, nodding. He squinted at Terrell's face. "Everything all right? You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders." It was the perfect opening. "It's Nia," Terrell said, sighing heavily. "She's gone, packed a bag and left last night. Said she was unhappy, that she needed something more than this town, more than me." He looked down at his hands, feigning a vulnerability he did not feel. "I guess I just wasn't enough for her." Sam straightened up, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. "Gone? Just like that? That doesn't sound like Nia. She loves this community. She loves her work." "That's what I thought," Terrell said, shaking his head sadly. "But people change, I guess. Her job, all those doctors and important people. I think it went to her head, made her think this life we had wasn't good enough." He was skillfully planting seeds of doubt, using Nia's own success as a weapon against her character. "I don't know where she went. She just said she needed to be away from it all." Sam looked genuinely troubled. "Well, I'll be. I'm sorry to hear that, son. Truly. If there's anything you need, you just let me know." "Thanks, Sam. I appreciate that," Terrell said, managing a weak smile. He had done it. He had sold the lie to the one person whose opinion mattered most on their small street. He walked back to his house, feeling a surge of triumph. He was in control. He had crafted the perfect story, a narrative so believable that no one would ever think to look in the basement. That night, as a cold rain began to fall, Terrell sat in the silent living room, drinking a beer. The house felt empty, but not in a lonely way. It felt peaceful, clean. The source of his anxiety and feelings of inadequacy was gone. He could hear the faint, low hum of the freezer from the floor below, a sound that should have been horrifying, but was, to him, strangely comforting. It was the sound of a problem solved, of order restored. He took a long swallow of beer and turned on the TV, the flickering light dancing on his face. He was just a regular guy, watching a ball game, a husband nursing a broken heart. The mask was perfect, and underneath it, the monster was smiling. Samuel Sam Jones had spent 20 years in the U.S. Army, much of it in intelligence. His job had been to observe, to notice the things that didn't fit, the subtle tells that betrayed a lie. It was a skill set that, once learned, never truly faded. Retirement had softened his edges, but it hadn't dulled his instincts, and something about Terrell Evans' story didn't sit right. Initially, Sam had taken Terrell at his word, offering sincere sympathy. The story was sad, but, on the surface, plausible. Marriages crumbled every day. But as the hours turned into days, small inconsistencies began to nag at him, like a persistent headache. He remembered a conversation he'd had with Nia just a few weeks prior. She had been admiring his late wife's rose bushes, and Sam had asked if she had family she visited for the holidays. "No," Nia had said with a sad, gentle smile. "It was just me and my grandmother, and she passed a few years ago. I was a foster kid before that. This town, the hospital, that's my family now." So, where was this aunt in Michigan that Terrell was now telling people she'd gone to visit? His suspicion grew the next day. Sam was in his yard, raking leaves, when he saw Terrell drag the large area rug from his living room out to the curb with the trash. It was a perfectly good rug. Sam had seen it just last week. It was an odd thing to throw away. Even odder was Terrell's behavior. He seemed jumpy, constantly glancing over his shoulder. Later that afternoon, Sam saw him scrubbing the hardwood floor of his porch with bleach, the acrid smell drifting over the fence. It was a frantic, almost obsessive cleaning. It wasn't the behavior of a heartbroken husband. It was the behavior of a man trying to erase a stain. The most unsettling detail, however, came from his dog, Shadow. The German Shepherd was old, his hips stiff and his muzzle gray, but his senses were as sharp as ever. Shadow had been a decorated K9 unit dog, trained in search and rescue. He was retired now, but his training was deeply ingrained. Every evening, Sam would walk him around the block. As they passed Terrell's house on the third night of Nia's absence, Shadow, who usually trotted along placidly, suddenly stopped dead. His body went rigid, his head cocked, and his nostrils flared, sampling the air. A low, deep whine emanated from his chest. He tugged on the leash, pulling Sam toward Terrell's house, his focus locked on a small, grated window that led to the basement. "What is it, boy?" Sam murmured, putting a hand on the dog's back. The fur was raised along his spine. Sam knew this behavior. This was Shadow's alert stance, the one he used when he had detected human scent in a place it shouldn't be. Sam felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He tried to pull the dog along, but Shadow wouldn't budge. He planted his feet and let out another low, mournful whine, his eyes fixed on the basement window. That was enough for Sam. His instincts, honed by years of observation and confirmed by the unerring senses of his dog, were screaming that something was terribly wrong next door. The story didn't add up. The strange behavior, the obsessive cleaning, and now, Shadow's irrefutable signal. Nia hadn't just left. The next morning, Sam made a decision. He walked down to the St. Clair Police Precinct, a small, tired-looking brick building that felt as neglected as the rest of the town. He asked to speak with a detective about a potential missing person. He was directed to a world-weary officer with a coffee-stained tie who listened to Sam's story with an air of profound boredom. Sam laid it all out. Nia's lack of family, Terrell's strange behavior, the dog's reaction. He spoke calmly and logically, presenting his observations as evidence. The officer, whose nameplate read Sergeant Miller, leaned back in his squeaky chair and sighed. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "The guy's wife leaves him, he cleans his house, and your dog whines at his window. And from that, you've cooked up a whole crime scene?" "I'm just saying it's suspicious," Sam insisted. "Nia is a responsible person, a nurse. She wouldn't just disappear without a word to anyone at her job, an official word." "He said she emailed them," Miller countered, not bothering to hide his impatience. "Look, Mr. Jones, we're busy here. We've got actual crimes to deal with. This sounds like a domestic spat. Happens all the time." He then leaned forward, his voice lowering into a conspiratorial, dismissive tone that made Sam's blood run cold. It's just a domestic issue, you know? They're a private couple. She probably got mad and took off to cool down. She'll be back in a week, and everyone will have forgotten about it. Best not to get involved." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. It's a black couple's problem, not our problem. The casual, systemic racism of the dismissal was as blatant as a slap in the face. Sam was being brushed off, his valid concerns reduced to the ramblings of a nosy old man meddling in their business. Sam stood up, his jaw tight with an anger he hadn't felt since his days in the service. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're making a mistake." Miller just shrugged and turned back to his paperwork, the interview clearly over. Sam walked out of the precinct and into the gray morning light, a cold fury burning in his chest. He had tried to do it the right way. He had tried to trust the system. But the system had failed, blinded by its own prejudice and indifference. He stood on the sidewalk, watching the cars crawl by. He looked back at the police station, then toward his home. If the police wouldn't listen, if they were going to let their biases potentially bury a woman alive, then he would have to find another way. The old soldier in him took over. The mission was clear: find out what happened to Nia Clark, and he would not do it alone. He had a partner whose instincts, unlike those of the St. Clair police, had never been wrong. He headed home to Shadow. Defeated but not deterred, Sam Jones knew he couldn't let the police's indifference be the final word on Nia's disappearance. He had seen too much in his life to stand by and do nothing when his gut and his dog told him a life was on the line. The system in St. Clair was broken, so he would go around it. He reached out to a man he had served with, a man who now held a high-ranking position in the state's Bureau of Criminal Investigation. He didn't ask for a full-blown investigation, just a favor, an official wellness check on Nia Clark, one that couldn't be ignored or brushed aside by the local precinct. The call from the state capitol worked. It lit a fire under the complacent St. Clair PD. The task fell to Detective Sophia Moretti. Moretti was a sharp, ambitious detective, a woman of Italian heritage who had fought her way up in a department dominated by men like Sergeant Miller. She was often seen as an outsider, too aggressive, too meticulous. She resented being assigned what she, too, initially believed was a pointless domestic call, likely instigated by a meddling neighbor. But an order was an order, especially one that came with pressure from on high. She arrived at Terrell Evans's house late the next afternoon. Terrell answered the door, the picture of weary grief. Moretti introduced herself, her expression neutral, her eyes taking in every detail of the man and the room behind him. "I understand your wife, Nia Clark, has been away for a few days," Moretti began, her voice professional. "We received a request for a wellness check, just to make sure everything is all right." Terrell sighed, running a hand over his face. "Detective, I appreciate the concern, but it's really not necessary. Like I told the other officer, Nia, she just needed some space. She went to visit her aunt. We had a fight. It's embarrassing is all." "Do you have a number for this aunt?" Moretti asked, her pen poised over her notebook. Terrell hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. "She's old school, not much for phones. Nia said she'd call me when she was settled." The lie was smooth, but Moretti's internal alarm bells, faint at first, began to ring a little louder. Everything was a little too rehearsed. "Mr. Evans, would you mind if I took a quick look around the house? Just procedure. We can close this out and I'll be on my way." A flicker of panic crossed Terrell's eyes before he masked it with an offended frown. "Is that really necessary? This is my home. I feel like I'm being treated like a criminal." "It's just to be thorough," Moretti said, her tone unyielding. "It will only take a few minutes." Reluctantly, Terrell stepped aside. Moretti walked through the house. It was unnaturally clean, smelling faintly of bleach. The living room was bare where the area rug should have been. It all felt sterile, scrubbed of personality, scrubbed of life. She found nothing out of place, nothing to contradict his story. Her initial assessment seemed correct. A domestic dispute blown out of proportion. She was about to thank Terrell for his time and leave when she noticed the door leading to the basement. "What's down there?" she asked casually. "Just the basement," Terrell said quickly. "Storage, the furnace. It's a mess. You don't need to go down there." His eagerness to dissuade her was the first real red flag. "Procedure," she said again, her voice firm. She walked to the door and turned the knob. It was locked. "I'll need you to open this, Mr. Evans." Terrell fumbled for the key, his hands visibly shaking now. He unlocked the door, and Moretti flicked on the light, revealing a set of steep wooden stairs. She was halfway down when her phone rang. It was her captain, demanding to know why she was wasting time on a he said, she said, when there was a robbery case developing across town. Annoyed and feeling the pressure, Moretti did a cursory scan of the basement from the stairs. She saw the furnace, old furniture covered in sheets, and shelves of junk. Nothing seemed amiss. "All right," she called up to Terrell, her frustration getting the better of her judgment. "This is a waste of time." She turned and started back up the stairs, just as Sam Jones's back door creaked open. He had been watching, waiting. With him was Shadow. Seeing Moretti about to leave, Sam made a bold move. "Detective!" he called out, his voice sharp and urgent. He walked quickly across his lawn to the edge of Terrell's property, Shadow trotting purposefully at his side. "Before you go, just let my dog take a quick sniff. For my peace of mind." Moretti was about to refuse, but something in the old soldier's eyes, a desperate certainty, made her pause. Terrell, however, stepped out onto the porch, his body blocking the way. "I'm not letting some mutt in my house," he snapped, his composure finally cracking. "This is harassment." The dog, however, wasn't listening. Shadow's training took over. He ignored Terrell completely. His nose was in the air, his body tensed. He trotted past the angry man, straight to the open basement door. He stopped at the top of the stairs, his tail rigid. Then, he let out a single sharp, authoritative bark. It was not a sound of aggression. It was a sound of discovery. He looked back at Sam, then down the stairs, and barked again. And then he did something Sam hadn't seen him do in 5 years. He began to scratch frantically at the top of the stairs, whining, his body trembling with a desperate urgency. It was his trained alert for a live human scent. A person was down there, and they were alive. The entire scene had frozen. Terrell stood, his face pale and slack with shock. Moretti stared at the dog, her skepticism vaporizing in a flash of adrenaline and horror. The meddling neighbor, the dismissive sergeant, the pressure from her captain, it all faded away. The only thing that mattered was the undeniable expert testimony of the old German shepherd. Sam Jones hadn't been a nosy neighbor. He had been right, and she had almost walked away. "Get out of the house, Mr. Evans," she said, her voice dropping to an icy, dangerous calm as she drew her service weapon. "Now!" The atmosphere on the quiet St. Clair Street shattered. Detective Moretti's command cut through the air, sharp and absolute. Terrell Evans, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, seemed to shrink before her drawn weapon. Shadow continued to whine and scratch at the top of the basement stairs, an unwavering four-legged accusation. The truth, long suppressed, was clawing its way to the surface. "On your knees! Hands behind your head!" Moretti ordered Terrell, her voice leaving no room for argument. She radioed for backup, her words clipped and urgent. "I have a possible hostage situation. Suspect is being detained. I need units at my location immediately." Within minutes, the street was flooded with the flashing red and blue lights of patrol cars. The sterile, quiet neighborhood had become a full-blown crime scene. As other officers secured a sputtering, protesting Terrell in the back of a cruiser, Moretti, her heart pounding, descended the basement stairs, her weapon held steady before her. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and deceit. Her eyes, now sharpened by suspicion, scanned the space with a fresh perspective. The stacks of junk, the covered furniture, it all looked different now, like props on a stage designed to hide something. And then she saw it. Tucked away in the far corner, partially obscured by a stack of old tires, was the large white chest freezer. Its very presence was an anomaly, too new, too clean for the grimy surroundings. A low, mechanical hum emanated from it, a sound that now seemed deeply sinister. Shadow, who had followed her down, went straight to it, sniffing frantically at the seal around the lid before sitting down and letting out another sharp bark, looking directly at Moretti. This was it. "God," Moretti breathed, a chill unrelated to the basement's temperature crawling up her spine. She holstered her weapon and approached the freezer. On top, just as Nia had feared, were 2 heavy metal toolboxes. A thick padlock secured the latch. They would need bolt cutters. The wait for the fire department to arrive with breaching tools was the longest 10 minutes of Moretti's life. When they finally did, the team worked quickly, the sharp snap of the bolt cutters echoing in the tense silence. With the lock gone and the toolboxes shoved aside, Moretti and a paramedic gripped the edges of the lid. "On three," Moretti said. 1, 2, 3. They heaved the lid open. A wave of brutally cold air washed over them, carrying with it a faint, clinical scent. For a moment, Moretti's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Curled in the fetal position, covered in a delicate, sparkling layer of frost, was the body of a woman. Her skin was a terrifying, waxy blue-white, her lips cracked and tinged with purple. Her eyes were closed, her hair frozen in crystalline patterns against her cheek. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been left in the snow. She looked dead. The paramedic, acting on instinct, reached in to check for a pulse, his fingers pressing against the icy flesh of her neck. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I don't feel anything," he stammered, his voice tight with shock. But Moretti saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible flutter of an eyelid, a faint, ghostly mist that appeared at her nostrils for a fraction of a second before vanishing. "She's breathing!" Moretti yelled. "Get her out of there! Now! Get the thermal blankets!" The basement exploded into a frenzy of controlled, professional action. The paramedics carefully lifted Nia's rigid, frozen body from the freezer. She was terrifyingly light. They laid her on a stretcher, immediately covering her with specialized thermal blankets designed for rewarming hypothermia victims. Her body was so cold it felt unnatural, like a marble statue rather than a human being. They hooked her up to a portable cardiac monitor, the device immediately shrieking an alarm at the slow, erratic beat of her heart. "Core temp is probably in the low 80s, maybe even 70s, one paramedic said to the other, his voice tense as he worked to establish an IV line in her frozen arm. "It's a miracle she's alive at all." As they worked, a young female EMT was tasked with cutting away Nia's fleece sweatshirt to apply EKG pads to her chest. As she pulled the fabric away from Nia's body, she let out a sharp, horrified gasp. "Oh my God! Detective, you need to see this." Moretti, who had been coordinating the scene, rushed over. The EMT pointed a trembling finger at Nia's exposed left thigh. There, stark against her pale, frozen skin, was a message. It wasn't written in ink. It was carved, the letters raised in a dark, angry red-brown, the blood having frozen in place. The inscription was crude but chillingly clear. Terrell did this. The sight of it punched the air from Moretti's lungs. This woman, on the brink of freezing to death, had found the strength and clarity of mind to leave a final, irrefutable testimony. She had turned her own body into evidence, a message in a bottle for a crime she was sure she wouldn't survive. It was the bravest, most heartbreaking thing Moretti had ever seen. "Photograph this," she ordered the crime scene technician, her voice thick with a mixture of awe and fury. "Document it from every angle before they move her." As the paramedics wheeled the stretcher up the stairs and out into the shocking brightness of the day, the gathered neighbors fell into a stunned silence. The sight of Nia, so still and pale, wrapped in silver blankets, was a vision from a nightmare. Sam Jones stood on his porch, his hand resting on Shadow's head, his face a grim mask of vindicated horror. He had been right. He had saved her life. Moretti followed the stretcher to the ambulance, her mind reeling. She turned and looked back at the house, now cordoned off with yellow tape. It looked so ordinary, so normal, but inside it had housed a monstrous secret, a secret that had been preserved in ice, and was now finally beginning to thaw. The emergency room at St. Clair General erupted into a state of high alert the moment the ambulance crew wheeled Nia Clark through the doors. The call had come in ahead of them. A Jane Doe, severe hypothermia, victim of a violent crime. Doctors and nurses swarmed the gurney, a whirlwind of calm, focused urgency. They cut away the rest of her frozen clothing, attached a web of monitors, and began the dangerous, delicate process of rewarming a body that had been pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. Leading the team was Dr. Anya Sharma, the hospital's chief of emergency medicine. She looked at the readings on the monitor with disbelief. Nia's core body temperature was 79 degrees Fahrenheit. Her heart was beating in a slow, dangerously erratic rhythm known as atrial fibrillation. Medically speaking, she should have been dead. "We need a warm IV saline drip now," Dr. Sharma commanded. "And get the bear hugger. We need to raise her temperature slowly. 1 degree an hour, no faster, or we'll send her into cardiac arrest." As they worked, Detective Moretti arrived at the hospital, her mind still reeling from the discovery. She watched the frantic life-saving efforts from a distance. The carved message on Nia's thigh burned into her memory. She had a would-be murderer in custody, but her case depended on the woman on that table pulling through. Moretti's next stop was the police station's interrogation room. Terrell Evans sat at the metal table, no longer angry, but wrapped in a cloak of smug denial. His court-appointed lawyer, a young, overworked public defender, sat beside him, advising him to stay silent. "Terrell," Moretti began, her voice deceptively calm as she sat opposite him. "Your wife has been found. She's alive. You have one chance to tell me your side of the story." Terrell scoffed, looking at his lawyer. "I don't have a side of the story. I don't know what you're talking about. I came home and my house was swarming with cops. This is all some kind of crazy mistake." "There's a brand new chest freezer in your basement, Terrell," Moretti continued, her eyes locked on his. "The kind of freezer you purchased with cash 2 weeks ago from an appliance store 40 miles out of town. We have the receipt." A flicker of surprise crossed Terrell's face, but he quickly recovered. "It was for the shop, for storing parts. I don't know how Nia got in there. Maybe she fell? Maybe she was sleepwalking? She's been under a lot of stress." Moretti felt a surge of disgust at his casual, pathetic lies. "She was sleepwalking, so she padlocked the lid from the outside and stacked 200 pounds of toolboxes on top of it." "I don't know anything about that," Terrell said, shaking his head, the picture of bewildered innocence. "Someone must be trying to set me up. Maybe one of her boyfriends from the hospital." He was relentless, his denials a brick wall of arrogance. He believed he was smarter than them. He believed he had committed the perfect crime. He would admit nothing. The interrogation went on for another hour, a circular dance of accusation and denial. Terrell remained steadfast, his performance unwavering. Moretti knew she wouldn't break him with questions alone. She needed something more. While the interrogation was happening, the forensics team was tearing Terrell's house apart. They found the sleeping pills he'd used to drug Nia. They found traces of her blood on the kitchen floor where her head had hit the refrigerator. They found his laptop, and on it, a search history that was a roadmap to murder. How long to freeze to death. Best soundproofing for basements. How to fake a runaway wife text message. But the final, undeniable piece of evidence came from the hospital. The crime scene photographer had finished documenting Nia's injuries. Moretti had been waiting for it. An officer brought a large manila envelope into the interrogation room and handed it to her. "Let's try this one more time, Terrell," Moretti said, her voice dropping. "Tell me what happened to your wife." "I told you. I don't know," he said with an exasperated sigh. "Okay," Moretti said softly. She opened the envelope and slid a single, glossy 8x10 photograph across the table. It landed directly in front of him. It was a clinical high-resolution photo of Nia's thigh. The carved words, stark and gruesome against her pale skin, seemed to leap off the page. "Terrell did this." Terrell stared at the photograph. The color drained from his face. His smug expression dissolved, replaced by a look of pure, slack-jawed horror. It was the one variable he had never considered, that Nia, in the depths of her icy tomb, would have the strength, the will, the sheer audacity to fight back in such a profound way. He had silenced her voice, but he hadn't silenced her. The wall of denial didn't just crack, it imploded. A guttural, animalistic sound escaped his throat. He looked from the photo to Moretti, his eyes wild with the terror of being caught. His carefully constructed reality had just been shattered by a message from a woman who was supposed to be dead. She was leaving me," he stammered, the words tumbling out, incoherent and desperate. "She was going to ruin me. I had to stop her. I just wanted to keep her, to keep us together." The confession, once it started, was a torrent. He admitted to everything: the drugging, the freezer, the fake text messages. The monster, stripped of its mask, was finally revealed. It wasn't a righteous warrior or a wronged husband. It was just a pathetic, insecure man whose pride was more valuable to him than his wife's life. Back at the hospital, under the warm glow of heat lamps, Nia Clark's heart, against all odds, found its steady rhythm again. Her eyelids fluttered open. The first thing she saw was the kind, worried face of Dr. Sharma. She was weak, she was in pain, but she was alive. And in the cold, quiet room of the police station, her message had delivered its final, devastating verdict. The trial of Terrell Evans was a brief, grim affair. Faced with an avalanche of evidence, the forensic findings, the damning search history, his own recorded confession, and the chilling photograph of Nia's self-carved testimony, he accepted a plea bargain. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 30 years. The day the judge's gavel fell, a strange quiet settled over the town of St. Clair. The monster who had walked among them was caged, but the scars he left on the community and on Nia were deep and permanent. Nia's recovery was a grueling marathon, not a sprint. She spent weeks in the hospital, battling the lingering effects of severe hypothermia and frostbite. She had to relearn how to walk, her muscles atrophied, her joints stiff and painful. The nerve damage in her fingers and toes was extensive, a constant tingling reminder of the profound cold that had nearly claimed her. Physical therapy was an exercise in daily agony and incremental victories, but the physical healing, arduous as it was, paled in comparison to the psychological journey. The world felt unsafe. A sudden chill in the air could trigger a panic attack. The low hum of a refrigerator sent waves of nausea through her. For months, she slept with the lights on, terrified of the suffocating darkness. The house she had once shared with Terrell was sold, its contents disposed of, a chapter of her life she wanted to burn to the ground. She moved into a small, bright apartment on the other side of town, its large windows a stark contrast to the windowless basement of her nightmares. She was not alone in her recovery. A small, unlikely family formed around her. Detective Moretti, who had gone from skeptical investigator to fierce advocate, checked in on her regularly, becoming a trusted friend. Dr. Sharma from the hospital became a mentor, guiding her not just through her physical recovery, but also through the complexities of her medical trauma. And then there was Sam Jones and his dog, Shadow. Sam visited her every few days, at first bringing groceries and later just his quiet, steady presence. He never pushed her to talk about what happened. Instead, he spoke of his garden, of his time in the service, of his late wife. He treated her not as a victim, but as a survivor, a fellow soldier who had endured an unthinkable battle. Shadow, the true hero of her rescue, seemed to understand his role perfectly. He would lie at her feet for hours, his warm, solid weight a comforting anchor to the present, a furry guardian against the ghosts of the past. It was Sam who, one sunny afternoon, about a year after her rescue, encouraged her to take the final step in her healing. A local community center was hosting a support group for survivors of domestic violence. "You have a story to tell, Nia," Sam said gently as she sat on her new balcony, watching the world go by. "Not for them, for you. Sometimes saying it out loud takes away its power." The thought was terrifying. To stand before strangers and lay bare the ugliest, most painful parts of her life felt impossible. But she looked at her hands, at the faint silvery scars on her fingers from the frostbite, and then thought of the more profound, hidden scar on her thigh. She had survived. She had borne witness against her own murderer. What was there to be afraid of now? That evening, she walked into the community center meeting room. It was filled with faces, men and women, young and old, of all races and backgrounds. Their circumstances were all different, but their eyes held a shared understanding. When it was her turn to speak, her voice trembled at first. "My name is Nia," she began, her hands gripping the podium. "And a year ago, my husband tried to murder me. He locked me in a freezer in our basement, and he left me to die." A hush fell over the room. She told them everything. She spoke of the slow, creeping control, the isolation, the fear. She spoke of the night of the attack, of waking up in the dark, of the all-consuming cold. And then she spoke of her decision to fight back. "I knew I was going to die," she said, her voice growing stronger, clearer, and the only thing I could think of was that he couldn't be allowed to get away with it. So I found a piece of wire, and I carved his name into my skin. I made my body into a message. I decided that if I couldn't live to tell my story, then my body would tell it for me. She looked out at the faces in the room, tears streaming down some of them. "I'm telling you this," she said, her voice now ringing with a power she didn't know she possessed. "Not so you will feel sorry for me, but so you will know this. The silence is what they want. The darkness is where they hide. Our fear is the lock on the door." She paused, taking a deep breath. "The lesson I learned in that freezer is that even in the deepest, coldest, most absolute darkness, you are never truly without a weapon. Your voice is a weapon. Your story is a weapon. And your will to survive. That is the most powerful weapon of all. Don't ever let anyone take that from you." When she finished, there was a moment of profound silence, followed by a wave of applause that filled the room. In that moment, Nia Clark was no longer just a survivor. She was a warrior. She had walked through the depths of hell and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. She had taken the darkest chapter of her life and turned it into a beacon for others, a testament to the incredible, resilient strength of the human spirit. The ice had been broken, and in its place, life, in all its messy, painful, and beautiful glory, had begun to bloom again.